hard to even imagine where you might start. So the next step has two functions. First of all, it's breaking it down into parts that are sort of manageable, but also remember that in my model of self, I had sort of defined this focus on discrete dimensions of who-ness, those personas. Social network analysis gives us some really cool tools, community prediction algorithms. And so I use those to extract groups of objects that tend to hang together, and that's kind of an actor network theory term. But they tend to have tighter ties with one another than with other things in the broader network. So I used, the one I used that was a good fit was the Gervin-Newman method. I used the Gervin-Newman algorithm to extract groups of objects that hang together in these plane networks. Some of them were personas, about 10, 11% of them. So you can see in black that those are the one, the largest subnetwork community structure in his overall plane network. So then we go into a structural coding phase, and this is where we bring grounded theory in. So we have the entire network landscape level, we have the community structure level, and then we have every little individual object and tie in here. So we code at the structure level. What is this collection of objects that the theory says has a tighter connection to one another than with the entire rest of the network? So why is it that these things are hanging together? And in figuring out why they're hanging together, you can code it as representing a particular type of thing. And then in the next step, within each of those persona networks, either doing it sort of all-inclusively and addressing every particular object in the network, or based on your questions, focusing on particular types of objects. For me, it was social structures and technologies. So friends being a social group, that was one of the things that I would analyze in this particular person's accounts. And really, it's a pretty systematic, straightforward process. Taking the object friends. Friends is tied to hanging out. So that one's kind of straightforward, but oftentimes they're a little bit more complex, and you have to bounce back and forth between the maps and the transcripts to make sure that you're interpreting it properly. I collected a whole bunch of other data that didn't actually get formally analyzed, but was really important in helping contextualize the data that I was examining. So if you're not familiar with grounded theory analysis, this is the Cliff Notes version. You have lots of data points. You assign them codes for what is going on here. What does this data represent? Those codes, you go through a round of reductive coding. They're reduced to concepts. Concepts are reduced even further into categories. Then you cross-reference various categories, cross-reference with theory to develop new arguments throughout the process. Memoing is a really important process in this, or part of this method, and that is remembering that in that play moment, in that interview moment, the researcher is a node in the network. So documenting your own role in the research process is particularly important from this perspective. So just to give you an idea of numbers here, almost 700 communities, reduced to 16 types. One of those was personas. Given my particular research question, I threw away the rest, or actually a nice little file on the side, and focused only on the persona networks. I did a further round of coding on the persona networks to try to understand exactly what was going on with the personas, what types of personas are being expressed in and around play, and really in terms of what emerged as important is that some personas were attributed to the player, some exclusively to the avatar, and some were being shared, or could kind of flip-flop back and forth. And so theoretically, that was what was important to answering my question. And across the 29 people, there were 11,000 unique objects in more than 27,000 relationships. And really, I did not, like I said, I didn't address the whole range of potential objects in those. That's definitely has room for future research there, but focus particularly on the ones that I could identify as social groups and technologies, because that is what my research question focused on. So how do you decide what level of coding you need to be addressing here? It's a matter of macro, meso, and micro levels of analysis. You have a pretty broad question you look at, and that's, I see them sort of as more descriptive, exploratory. What the heck is going on here in the first place? Those are, you're looking at the community structures and the relationships among them. If you're at the meso level, examining particular phenomenon, just like I was interested in personas in particular. already identified, coded at the meso level, you'll break them down and see what's going on there. And then at the micro level, that's where you go to the objects and the particular object relations. And it sounds kind of cloudy. Above the line was the first part of this study, and that was just thematic analysis. That's another good point, is that this is really, really flexible and can be combined with a range of other approaches. This was thematic analysis for player avatar relationship types. I used it to sort of structure how I conducted the second half, but I mean, I'm addressing object level here, I'm addressing personas, and then basically this larger situational level. This thing takes forever, and this is why I'm working currently on figuring out a way that I might be able to make it less resource intensive, more scalable, working with different types of data, that sort of thing. The particular power here is that it can open up silences. If I went into this study only thinking about avatars, first of all, avatars are an incredible assemblage in themselves and have all sorts of things that I would have never even thought of that players experience as part of their avatars. Particularly important are headcanons, these stories that players make up about how their avatar fits in the world. I would have never even known about that. So it opens up silence. Greg Harmon calls it the dark matter, and Bruno Latour is the missing mass, the things that we can't normally attend to because we have these sort of blinders on. Highly interpretive, depending on your school of thought, that's either good or bad, but it is very flexible and has applications across a wide range of studies. So currently, I'm working on how to integrate both image and text. Basically, I'm trying to expand the multimodality part of this. How do we bring in screenshots and players' role-play diaries, that sort of thing. I'm working to figure out if I also have all of these players, I have short stories from them, to see if we can extract the same types of things from shorter accounts than from these very, very long accounts. I'm rewriting this method particularly for game studies where there is a fairly well-accepted notion that gameplay is an assemblage of human and non-human objects or agencies, and writing it particularly for game studies. And then we're in the planning stages right now of working to understand how identity might be playing into moral decision-making in games. Do I shoot this person or not? So, and then after that is going to be an effort to see if I can use natural language processing software to pull out these same types of relationships. Again, that's an effort to make it scalable. Again, expanding the modalities. So, for example, in play assemblages, kind of the only accepted method right now is ethnography. This could be used to sort of supplement ethnographic. For me, I'm an interpretive scholar, but my brain wants structure. So that was really kind of how this came into play here. And again, I mentioned mapping with the avatar. So that's what's coming up after that. Any questions? Sorry, you're the MC there.
This is really fascinating. I'm wondering when you start incorporating in gameplay and aesthetics and avatars, are you also going to be reading that against the long-form narrative accounts to see whether or not they're actually differ from the way they describe them?
I would like to. So I do have chat logs. I have combat logs. Actually, the interviews, there were 2 interviews, one that was only voice and one that was voice and play. And so there are some very different types of language going on when we were playing together. I'm kind of lumping those both together, but one of the other steps is to separate them out and see if there are particular types of assets that we can pull out of the gameplay record.
Because it seems to me there's a question of what the object of study is here in terms of their narrative descriptions themselves, as opposed to the way that you're actually performing it.
That was the exact purpose of the play interview.
Yeah.
Was to make sure that we were getting sort of not just the given, but the given off, if you will. And yeah, I think you have a good point, and it's definitely in progress. It's exciting.
Willie,
I find your talk really exciting, primarily because I think you're opening the discussion on the study of complexity
couple of patterns. They ended up not actually, my advisor was protecting me from myself when it came to that. Remember my kind of main purpose or my overarching question was player-avatar relationships. So what I saw was that people who had more parasocial relationships with their avatars, more intimate ones, emotionally intimate, and seeing that the avatar as a legitimate social other, they tended to have more tightly woven networks. They had fewer branches and greater kind of density in the center, using the same layout algorithms across all. So that's that would be great to explore.
Matt?
It seems like the self-identities of the networks can be very subjective in terms of how a person would envision a girl gamer network and someone else. And we also need different characteristics of reflection. Like maybe one player would self-identify as a girl gamer, another would not, and perceive that.
So part of the decision that I made in this study was to not standardize object codes across cases, specifically for that reason, because even while I'm taking this sort of detached group of objects, I'm constantly going back and forth between the visualization and the data to make sure that I'm staying true to how the player has described it, and sort of drawing on that phenomenology type mindset. Sensitivity. I mean, that's what I was going for, was the lived experience of it, how they're describing it, not a standardization across cases.
So, at the beginning, you were talking about your idea of the self, and it seemed to me like it was a kind of emergent multiplicity and that implies to me a kind of limitlessness or boundlessness. But in the situations, you will be broken down into a finite amount of bits, or that's the way you describe it. So I wonder how you reconcile that boundlessness of self and a finite situation that can be broken down to.
Sure. So the bounding function in the interview process has two sort of controlling forces. One is the researcher during the interview or other type of data collection, and for me, I gave a lot of power to the other half of the other force, and that was the player. Remembering that what's important is how the player experiences themselves. And of particular note is I did ask some questions about identity and how do you think this avatar represents you, or does it? So I did ask some of those questions, but largely it was around play in general. So whatever they saw as relevant was what counted as data. And then my role, actor network theory as kind of a theory method package, puts a responsibility on the researcher, understanding the full risks and implications of the researcher controlling what counts as the network. For me, if I ask a question, as long as their narratives sort of were in the same realm, that's cool. But if they started going off on their brother's mother's raid 3 years ago, then I kind of, after a certain point, I stopped it and tried to drag them back into the question, the root question. So it's kind of just a limitation because every object is in itself a complex network of other objects. It could thread, it can go on forever. So it's just kind of it's a responsibility that the researcher has to take to define the boundaries and a rationale for defining those boundaries.
I have several questions, but I already nailed them.
Okay.
They're technical. But I have one that I'm curious about. Did you go back to any of the players to ask them, is this you?
I did not do it in that form, like giving them the
To
visualizations.
evaluate. Yeah.
I did not. I did do some member checks on concepts, like am I interpreting this properly, that sort of thing. But in terms of the networks themselves, I was advised by multiple parties not to do that.
So is there a way to evaluate this, that this is a self, actually?
I think we could. I hadn't really thought about it, largely on the grounds that it would require training for people to potentially understand exactly what those visualizations mean. And then does the training color interpretations of it. Just because I take on a sort of postmodern view of the self doesn't mean the bodies don't count.
Right. Yeah. But at one point you had mentioned, let me see, that we're in a body and we're part of this sort of assemblage. I was wondering if you could just maybe talk a little bit more about embodiment and how it plays out in this, and particularly this idea that it's not that we have bodies, but that we are bodies, which would be part of a broader phenomenological understanding of the body.
Sure. In terms of how bodies played a role in the assemblage, it wasn't just whole bodies. And actually, whole bodies counted a lot less for these people in my mapping. It was body parts. It was bellies and hands and fingers, and hair is really important. And sort of a likeness or a difference from the crafted body in the avatar. Really because my object focus was not on embodiment. Actually, if you want to analyze that with me, let's go do it. But I can't expand too much on that. But I did recall seeing how incredibly important body parts are. And it's hands on mice. It is pushing buttons. It is, I see myself as having a sort of fluid gender, but I can't create that in my avatar. I'm constrained in these ways, and I'm liberated in these ways. So narratively, those are the patterns.
I was thinking about the notion of what happens in these networks. We will go back to the famous dash in actor network theory.
Yes.
That's what what happens in the flow stream between these various parts, these points in the network. How do these people interact? Do we find something meaningful or important in the way in which the flows would happen between them?
So when you say flow, are you talking about over time?
What I'm talking about what happens in interaction between, because I noticed, of course, that the main contribution to this excellent work, very, very interesting, is in identity construction. But I was thinking that perhaps you see identity construction as something that happens not only through self-identification, or role or persona identification, various means that we can service it, but also through the interactions between one particular player and another player. So I was wondering if you had any means of seeing any information being played between different people, and you could think about the ways that the flows between them.
So in terms of how other people functioned in these networks, or in the persona network specifically, what I saw, what the patterns and the meaning between social others, social groups or individuals, and other objects, human players and other humans functioned in persona networks as foils or as associations, really. And so what I saw was that avatars were much less often a performance of a perceived self, and more often rebellion against other people. If I compare myself against, okay, let me think of an example. One of my players grew up in a Catholic family, and he didn't like that when he became an adult, so he made a Tauran shaman as an avatar. So that's based off of Native American culture, sort of an earth-based spirituality, and so his avatar was a construction of rebellion against his childhood religious upbringing. Sometimes people will do that same type of thing against other people. My mom wants me to be this, so I'm going to be that. But then there were also affinities. And affinities came out according to avatar names, guild names, and guild cultures, all sorts of different things. And so when it came to social groups, like in technological agencies, it was about how do I work with it, how do I work against it, how do I work around it. With social groups, it was very much about, do I see myself as that? If so, I'm going to align with that. Do I not see myself as that? I'm going to distance myself through that, from that through my particular agencies in the game. So there's definitely a lot of room to look at there.